Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francesca Graham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, everyone, to another fantastic episode of the Star Chamber. Before we get started, we'd like to thank all of our listeners who have combined thousands of listens to this podcast. So that's pretty awesome. So
Incredible.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So on our show today, we have the great honor of welcoming Miss Catherine McClanahan. She is a 30-year spouse of an Air Force Reserve officer, a mom to 3 children, 3 boys specifically, and she has spent her last 30 years supporting her husband in his Air Force career, as well as homeschooling their 3 boys. So obviously, huge task that never ends.
Wow.
There is no end to the day for her. In addition to being a mom and a spouse to Air Force Reserve officer, her and her family were one of the families that were living on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam during the time frame of the 2021 Red Hill fuel spill disasters. So in this podcast, we're going to learn a little bit more about Catherine, and we're also going to learn about Kat's unique journey from wife and mom to advocate and detective here shortly.
/IG.
Exactly. slash IG, who couldn't do their IG job. No big deal. But first, before we start that, let's do a quick disclaimer. The opinions and views expressed by guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not represent the official policies, positions, or endorsements of the U.S. Air Force, the Department of Defense, or any other government entity. This discussion is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as reflecting the official stance of any military or governmental organization. And what do we say, Ryan?
Suck it,
Poindexters. Exactly. I mean, we don't have to say that every time, but I figure since we have to say the disclaimer, we just should say that every time.
I feel like I have to.
I feel like it. I agree. I agree. So, Catherine, thank you so much for coming on to our show. It's truly an honor to have you, not just because of your courage to come on the show, but also your courage and your resiliency to do the work that you have done to expose the cover-up of the Red Hill fuel spill disasters. And you've done a ton of very detailed work on this topic. And we're just really, really excited to chat with you about it.
Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate the time that you've given to the Red Hill families.
Yeah, and I'd like to apologize to all the listeners for having lied. We said this was going to be a 3-part series on the Red Hill fuel spill and subsequent cover-up. But serendipitously, between episodes 2 and 3, Kat reached out to us, and she's got a heck of a story that really adds a lot to this saga. So we're going to add it, and we'll call this episode 2A. It'll still be a 3-part series, so it's not a total lie. But what she's done, what she's experienced, which is reflective of what thousands have seen and know to be true, is really a story worth telling. So, Kat, thanks for reaching out. Thanks for being a listener of the show. And like Cheska said, I'm going to say it as well. Thanks for having the moral courage to speak out against the corruption and cover-up which has occurred and is occurring. So, Kat, tell us a little bit about yourself.
In general, I'm a homeschool mother who was a
years ago in my previous lifetime, I had a master's of science in speech pathology and had worked in hospitals for about 10 or 12 years, working with neurologically impaired, but as a speech therapist, a lot with language, speech, and swallowing.
Kat, what brought you to Red Hill? And after that, kind of talk us through the events of 2021 and what took you from a speech pathologist, homeschooling mom to a forensic scientist, essentially.
We arrived in Hawaii August 2019 and really say it was a dream location. My husband was nearing the end of his career and we knew, and this opportunity to come to Hawaii, to go to Hawaii had opened and we jumped on it. We were so excited we're adventuresome, very outdoors type people, and we loved the chance. So we arrived, everything seemed great.
Mm-hmm.
In summer of 21, I started experiencing some unusual symptoms that initially I thought maybe I getting old, had some unusual shortness of breath that seemed to come and go. But 6 or 8 weeks later, my husband started experiencing that same fleeting shortness of breath sensation. And I had begun developing pain, most definitely late summer of 21. And the pain initially started like in one wrist, quickly within days was in both wrists, my neck, and some unusual where just pulling out of a parking lot, I would like say to my husband, whoa, don't move. Like that's too fast of a move. So I believe I was experiencing some unusual symptoms, but I wouldn't have run to a doctor. In early November, had a horrible looking rash and just strange feeling where you think I'm very tired, don't really know why. Had struggled with maybe not really admitting it, but recognizing later as it got worse, difficulty following conversations.
Yeah, and that's something that was standing out to me as you were talking was you started experiencing these symptoms in May. And that's something
Yeah.
that the Department of the Navy and the Department of Defense Inspectors General, they're completely ignoring that there were 2 previous spills or incidents prior to November.
Yeah, I can always say I for sure know by August that I had symptoms, but hard to say, was it May or was it August? Honestly, I would lean towards late summer.
So you start feeling these symptoms, and then we all know what happens. November 2021, the official accounting at least, 19,000-gallon spill. We surmise is far more than that. And then eventually the Navy and military admit to it after some teeth gnashing, 2 weeks, in fact, of it, of obfuscating the truth and obfuscating the severity of the spill, something they still do to this day. We can say beyond a preponderance of the evidence. So that all plays out, Kat. Tell us about what you endeavor upon following those spills.
Thanksgiving week of 21 will, I think, always stand out very vividly in my mind. I remember conversations from Thanksgiving Day. A friend asked me if I wanted to go to Black Friday at the NEX the next day. And I told her, I've just felt so sluggish and hurting and not sleeping. I'm startling awake during the night. I don't know how I'll sleep. I've had what, we kind of term disruptive sleep right now, like a lot since then. But we had all had GI issues after Thanksgiving. But of course, you just attribute it to, you ate rich food or something. When the Navy announced something was wrong, actually a young family from another housing unit, one of the first, actually the first housing units identified as contaminated, they were told their water was unsafe, but ours, we were told, was safe. We lived on Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. We were actually bringing that young family over to our house to bathe. 4 young children. I was wearing a wrist brace that I would alternate wrist braces because it was a coming and going about this pain. And the mother had reached out to me to say she had just not been feeling well. And it will always kind of haunt me because the baby, she had told me they were actually getting close to referring him out to neurology for what she called staring episodes.
Wow.
And this was her 4th child. She was not new to infants, right? My husband actually left Ireland the Sunday after Thanksgiving. He had gone to Japan, and within a week, we would talk every 3 days, and that unusual shortness of breath for me had gotten significant enough that I began being concerned. I was a collegiate swimmer, was in excellent physical shape. It was notable, but it wasn't like I felt like shortness of breath, like I'd pass out. Within a week, he called me, and he in this phone conversation, he actually brought up the fact that that weird breathing thing had gone away.
Hmm.
And I said, well, I'm actually concerned because mine's actually gotten worse. And it was worse tonight. I was just sitting here on the sofa reading for an hour, and it was worse. Well, that didn't have anything to do with exercising, right? So the next day, they had white tents where you could go report symptoms, seek medical care. Nothing seemed severe in the house except this weird shortness of breath. The GI issues, they said, would be fleeting. It's not a problem. Just stop drinking the water. But I was concerned about the shortness of breath. So I went to the white tents.
Mm-hmm.
My neighbor actually was walking there, and I picked her up on the way. And we sat in our car together, and spoke to the triage tent people that came up to your car. And I just remember my neighbor saying, what do you mean? She's saying she's short of breath. And the response I got from the military medical staff was, well, we can't help you. You're a civilian.
Despite the fact that you are a military dependent, the military triage teams were turning you away.
Yes, they said, you're not on TRICARE. My husband, it didn't matter that he was in uniform, that he was actually TDY, because of his status. He was not on what they refer to as on orders, meaning he's not on TRICARE medical care. So they suggested they kind of gave me the choice. If you think that it's urgent, you can go to emergency room or your physician. And I didn't think it was an emergency. It would be like, again, I would tell you, it was a fleeting thing. Now we look back, it was when I was in the home for any period of time. But so by the time I've done this for an hour, I'm not feeling it as severely. I have no idea why. But so I called my physician, and that began what I'll just tell you. It was a cascading of symptoms and unexplained emergencies that ended, hopefully one day will end.
So I'd like to pivot, Kat, for a little bit then. You initially reached out to me and talked about some forensic work you did with the water sampling and some discrepancies with what you were seeing. Talk to me about how you came to that and how you started and how you went about that and what you found.
I began recognizing something was to do with earlier than November 20th. And why are they only focusing? And I then began hearing about this May leak. So I began following up and asking questions with Hawaii Department of Health. What do you know? What happened? And everything at the time, so this is still in early 2022, everything at the time was about the November 20 leak. And then by spring of 22, at this point, we've lived through where my neighbor's water had been one of those that they had called in and had gotten a sample taken by the Navy. And we found out months later that they had thrown those samples away. They never tested them. We've been having to live through this denial. And in March of 2022, I'm still looking for help. And I'm convinced, you remember, I'm a proud military family. I'm still looking for help. We recognize I'm getting worse. They're telling us this was a fleeting thing, and all these symptoms for me are worsening and not going away. I remember very distinctly somebody sent me an interview, and in that interview, it was the Navy Pacific Fleet surgeon, Captain Michael McGinnis, and it said, "What is your response to families saying that they're still struggling with symptoms?" So this is 4 months after the leak has been announced. And it's as if he didn't miss a beat. No pause, no consideration that maybe they don't have all the facts. He said, we do know that stress manifests as physical symptoms. That's something to consider.
First time we're hearing directly from the U.S. Pacific Fleet's highest ranking doctor and other military officials about how they're responding to the Navy's tainted water crisis. It started more than 3 months ago, and many neighborhoods still have no drinkable water.
And today, military officials held a news conference to talk about how they're responding. Captain Michael McGinnis, surgeon for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, says he's seen reports of families who believe they've been sickened by longer-term illnesses from the fuel-tainted water.
So trying to figure out, is this just me kind of overreacting, or is this something real?
Medical teams saw 6,000 people during the crisis. Common symptoms included nausea, vomiting, headache, and rash. But McGinnis says the fuel exposure was temporary. Complaints have gone down starting from early December, and no one has been hospitalized for petroleum toxicity.
We have no evidence to suggest that there's ongoing acute exposure or symptoms related to the water distribution system.
Do you think that any of the families are making up their symptoms because of this fuel event?
You know, I would not conjecture that families are making up their complaints. And certainly stress can manifest in physical symptoms. And so that's something to consider.
So it's all in your head. It's all in your head. Kat, it is all in your head.
It's not the fuel itself that's making them sick. It's the fuel in the water that's making them sick.
Exactly. Oh, so good.
And then they say this, and it was when it dawned on me the DOD is not coming to help us. I was fully convinced until then they're going to help us. I had just been in the ER, and it's that realization that hits you where they're not trying to help. And I really had not believed a lot of this pushback against the Navy initially, because I felt like, no, I know Navy members, and they're honest and admirable people, and these people would do the right thing. We are their people. I still considered myself a military family. This has all been on our medical dime at this point, though, and yet I'm still convinced they're coming to help. They just need to get to the right people. And at that point, it came very clear to me, they're not coming. This is a complete denial that this is in our heads. And at that point, that weird shaky feeling I'd been having, initially it'd start when I was exercising, but at this point it was all the time. I knew that that wasn't something to do with stress. I knew that this weird GI stuff that was still going on, there was enough unusual patterns within families. At that point, I think I emailed people that I don't remember. I literally have, I think, forgotten. Sometimes people will tell me, do you remember we talked about such and such during that time? And I'm like, I have no memory of it.
So who were the first people that you contacted where you actually started getting some of this data?
So I think the first people that I ever received any data from were neighbors and families who were also affected. And I'm seeking help. I'm asking other affected families about their symptoms. And it's really families pooling together to seek and try to find answers to what is happening to us. And really what was really astonishing, and it was multiple affected families of every rank, every branch, spouses, service members, military and civilian families affected that were coming together and trying to help figure out what are total petroleum hydrocarbons, what was in the jet fuel. So I like to tell people that those same people 3 years later, we now consider ourselves water friends, and we began helping each other seek deeper answers into why this effects of this were not going away for us. And so a few agency staffs were willing to answer basic questions, but it seemed there were so little answers to basic things we had. But we even began finding local Hawaiians who weren't even affected by the fuel. They cared so much. They would help research data, and they would provide us information and answers. They would answer technical questions. They'd provide bottled water. And then experts around the island, we learned of their conversations or from a previous leak. You had the Ernie Lau and Erwin Kawada. I think of Hawaii Department of Health had some scientists who were willing to answer questions and teach us about total petroleum hydrocarbons. They were all helping. So the water friends, we just keep pooling together, putting together information that each of us may have gained separately, going to these meetings or asking scientists and different questions. And we, in the end, I would say 3 years later, it's taking affected families who wouldn't sit by and accept the narrative that the Navy was pushing because it contradicted the similar and persisting symptoms in multiple people of all ages, and what more and more of the data was showing as we were slowly getting information. So who helped along the way? It seems everyone was willing to help except the Navy.
Ah, there it is. Except the people that should be. Bingo.
Yeah. And that's the tragedy in this.
Yes.
We still have so many unanswered questions and inconsistencies in the data, and our health and the health of our kids really depends on the whole truth. And these water friends, we're going to keep digging and pushing and asking for answers and asking for accountability. And I always tell people, and any military leader or government official I speak to, it shouldn't be this hard. You know that we drank jet fuel and many of us did not recover. So we'll just keep doing it. The water friends and all those that have supported and provided answers and not been willing to hide the information from us will just keep speaking out and asking questions until we get somewhere and get to the truth.
So I think the first time I heard any honest discussion about total petroleum hydrocarbon, which is what jet fuels contaminants they look for in the water, was Dr. Roger Brewer from the Hawaii Department of Health, who just explained to several spouses at a meeting, like, this is what we were looking for. This is what is allowed in the water. And this is what was at the time. This is where your water level was. And why was this the threshold? So there became a discussion of why was the threshold up until 2017 here. And now in 2021, the threshold had been moved up to here to how much jet fuel is allowed in the water. And then we drank a threshold that was 350 times what was safe. So I would think that Hawaii Department of Health was probably the first time I heard some information.
I'm going to interrupt you. For our viewers who can't see what you were just now doing, Kat was, I'm just going to throw some random numbers. Kat was basically describing that prior to 2019, I think you said, we'll say that
2017, I think.
17,
Don't quote me. Yeah.
the threshold was supposed to be, say, was listed as like, say, 100.
It was like 50 to 100 or something.
And then after threshold was like, say,
400.
But you realized from this briefing that you guys were drinking at a threshold of like 3,000.
At the November league, 350 times whatever 400
was the acceptable, quote unquote, acceptable threshold that was even still over almost 3 times higher than what it had been in 2017, even to start with.
Yeah, and nothing to do with anything having to do with stress. That is people drinking jet fuel, period. And what's interesting, Kat, about, and we'll get to more of the forensic work you do here after this, you have encapsulated and recapped basically everyone we have advised the journey that you go on, because like you are a longtime military family, huge believer in the system, huge believer in the lie, which was we will take care of our people regardless of the cost. And you don't want to believe it when you're being betrayed. It's such a deep and fundamental moral injury when this service, this military that you have devoted the majority, if not your entire adult life to, who has said the whole time, we're going to take care of you, people are our most valuable asset, support the troops, etc., then not only poisons you, but lies about it, denies you health care that you're entitled to, just as an American, let alone a service member's family, and then starts to cover it up, showing that the true priority is not you, it's saving face and evading culpability. It is a sad pattern of behavior we just see all too often. So sorry to interject. Now you're getting some real answers because you're not taking it with the military. And Department of Health in Hawaii is being, it sounds like, very forthright and forthcoming about how much jet fuel how much fuel you were drinking. All right, now walk us through your next actions.
I began asking questions then about where do I find those reports and where do those get reported? And again, at this point, there's, people are doing more work. You look at this website, this shows you. And I began noticing that the website would list dates of when the amounts were reported to Department of Health. But I began seeing these reports and how there would be months of lag time between when a water sample was collected and when the Hawaii Department of Health was notified of the result.
And who at this time is doing the testing and sampling?
So from my understanding, and I'm just a spouse.
Nobody is just a spouse.
I
hate that.
There's a subcontractor that the Navy uses, AECOM or AECOM, who has staff who go out and take water samples. They then send those samples off to, at the time, were 2 labs on the mainland to test water samples, who then report those actual water tests back to AECOM, who then take the water test results and write a report and produce the numbers supposedly straight from those tests, produce those results to then turn over to regulators. I found some documents where they contended, and you'll have to, I'll maybe rusty on the dates, but they had contended that they didn't need to test for 2-MeE, which is methyl ethyl exol or something like that. It's the fuel system icing inhibitor, because they had shown how they'd had some number of years of it not showing up, so they shouldn't have to test for it anymore. But what I'm noticing, remember, there's a website now you can go and you can read the data, the actual reports, and look at them, is that there's a whole lot of months lag time between when they take a sample and when they turn it over to a regulator.
Just to clarify here, the process, just so I understand and everybody else does, is, as you understand it, Kat, the sampling is being done by a private firm who is subcontracted out by the U.S. Navy, who was responsible for the spill. And then that company, again, being paid by the Navy, they pay that company to take the samples, and then those samples are sent back to the mainland and back, and then the company prepares a report for regulators. Is that the system? Do I understand that?
And I tell you, this might help. Let me give you one sample explanation. This was in a Civil Beat article. A sample that was taken in late July, August 2021 exceeded the allowed environmental action levels. So they were required to report this. The allowed jet fuel, total hydrocarbons in the water had exceeded the safe level. A sample that was taken early August 5th, was not reported to Hawaii Department of Health until October. So 2 months. Now, the Navy is contending they reported it September 23rd. But again, I'll remind you, it's an exceedance, and the samples were taken in late July, August, and were not reported until the Navy claims September 23rd, but the Hawaii Department of Health claims October 19th.
And also, from what I understand, how you explained it, is that there could be other chemicals, particulates, toxins, etc., that aren't even being tested for because it's beholden to either the Navy or the subcontractor to test for certain things. And even there were some particulates that, because years past the tests were good, that they weren't even being monitored, like this 2-EE. I'm sorry if I'm misquoting the chemical,
2-MeE.
but 2-MeE, because there had been no presence prior to the spills, and therefore was not required to be tested anymore. So there was 2, maybe more issues going on. Number one was you had the Navy pulling the strings on the test. I think it's a familiar conflict of interest I've heard somewhere else.
Everywhere else.
Interesting. So that, and then not only is it, you've got that conflict of interest, you've got the delays, but you also have the tests that are being delayed for whatever reason, and or not testing for every potential toxin, particulate, chemical that could be harmful to the populace. Also true?
True, and let me caveat, they might have seen something on their water tests that came straight from the lab that they are not required to turn over to regulators.
Okay.
So if it's not a regulated contaminant, they are
Probably not going to be published. Okay.
There were then further reports that came out by April. We found out through Hawaii Department of Health that there were reports of other exceedances throughout August of 2021 that took 6 to 8 months for the Hawaii Department of Health to be notified. And
Wow.
I had emailed a different person at that point at Hawaii Department of Health and asked, because again, you see these reports and they come out in the news and you're saying, why didn't you, Hawaii Department of Health, help us and warn us? And they said, we didn't know. We did not receive this result for 6-8 months.
And again, that's a test sample taken 2 months prior to the officially admitted spill, right? So the Navy sticks to, there's a spill in November 2021, but the August results show that there was likely something before that. I don't want you to try and answer for them, but this is a rhetorical question. How does the Navy reconcile that?
So I'm not sure I've heard the Navy. I do know, because I asked the Hawaii Department of Health, and the Hawaii Department of Health did follow up with a question I had. Is here they had reported documented cases of 6-8 months delayed in reports. And what did the Navy say? Why did they not provide you these results? Because this was the summer of 2021, and there are multiple tests of exceedance. And their response in an email was that the Navy stated that they had excessive delays at the labs. So the Navy said it's the labs that were the delays.
Which are contracted out, so they're trying to take visibility off of the Navy itself.
The Navy claimed that those delayed reports were due to substantial delays at the labs, in quotes. Like, I began downloading every one of those reports at that point. I wanted to see what kind of delays are we talking about, and what kind of patterns. Is this a chronic problem, or is this a one-off problem? And so I ended up just basically downloading all of the reports that I could find. And I began looking at patterns and looking at how many are we talking about, average delays, because the reports show whether or not the lab completed testing on a date. So you have a firm date of when the lab tested. So I'm going to share with you on 8 tests that I looked at from just summer of 2021 into fall of 2021, before the November leak. The lab's average test time that they took to take a sample and finish testing a sample averaged more like less than 2 weeks. Okay. I'm going to read you the days between the last test run at the lab and when the reports were being issued. 220 days.
Oh my God.
27 days, 95 days, 143 days, 19 days, 24 days, 8 days, and 20 days. So you take that from when the lab first received them, and now we're talking months. And that is what Hawaii Department of Health was answering to me. The delays that they weren't receiving the reports because the Navy wasn't turning them over. But when I look back and look through, and I think it ends up being 130 reports, 125 maybe, the averages were something like 17 days from the time a sample received at the lab to when it was completed testing at the lab. But the average time for the report to be issued, it was something like 80 days.
And this is also, in terms of the context of the situation, there is a major natural disaster health crisis ongoing where the people and the families of the Navy and the local community are being sickened by this. And everyone seemingly in the government is okay accepting this 3-month turnaround on getting what are pretty critical results, right?
Yes, I would say are alarming results. So here's what I concluded. The delays in those reports were not due to the labs.
And by that, you mean when it goes from the lab back to the U.S. Navy, that's where the delay was occurring? Okay.
Yes. So what they are telling the Hawaii Department of Health, I'm arguing is wrong. That's not true.
Mhm.
The data shows from May until the November leak, the delays were due to the Navy and their subcontractor, AECOM.
So this is from the DODIG investigation. So, quote, we asked Navy officials why they were not testing for free product in the Red Hill well. According to a written response we received from NAVFAC officials, the groundwater monitoring procedure included a step for, quote, free product gauging, unquote. However, a modification was made to the sampling procedure for the Red Hill well. According to Navy officials, the oil-water interface meter used to test for free product during groundwater monitoring is, quote, typically rented equipment by the sampling contractor. This is still the response from the Navy. In the past, the rented equipment would have noticeable and very strong hydrocarbon odors from past users by other renters at different sites, unquote. So basically, the Navy is not going to test because if we test, we'll poison people. It's like, what?
Yes, and not only that, we're okay with that. We're just not going to test.
Right. And the irony of this is that you have a person who the DoD will not even provide medical care to in a pop-up white tent outside of a facility. A single person, Kat, who is able to find out this data all on her own and collate and analyze and put together all this data on all these failures. And yet the DODIG, with all of its investigatory authorities and power and people and hundreds of thousands of dollars that's being put towards them every year, is completely absent.
I found it striking that the response that the DODIG accepted, being the Navy's lapdog, was a written one that seemingly no one was interviewed, just as Shannon was not interviewed, just as other experts and eyewitnesses were not interviewed in that quote-unquote thorough and exhaustive 3-year investigation.
Exactly. Kat, one of the things that you mentioned, I think in an email, was that you have toxin-induced Parkinson's disease.
Doctors who first finally did some tissue biopsying found I have small fiber neuropathy, which they can't figure out why I would have. I don't have any indicators for having it. Some toxicologists believe it may be one of the early biological markers of Red Hill. They're calling mine atypical onset. And I learned this throughout this tragedy and all my symptoms is that atypical onset means the neurologist was referring to it that way. High majority of people who have Parkinson's have a decade or two of these subtle symptoms that go and keep continually getting worse and worse. And then they get a secondary symptom and then a third symptom. And by the time they get to neurologists, they really can answer this questionnaire we were given. And I was a no to every single question until November of 2021. All of my symptoms came on within 2-3 months of Red Hill. And that's what they're calling atypical onset. I know so many people with tremors, with balance issues, had nystagmus, had the pain, and still have pain and numbness and coldness to extremities, all of these type of symptoms.
You know, everything you just now listed out is so utterly heartbreaking because mistakes happen. Fuel spills occur. That is not the crime. The real crime is the fact that the Navy and the Department of Defense, with the Department of Defense IG as its lapdog, intentionally covered up these accidents, these mistakes for months, if not probably years even.
Years.
Given the research that use a lone person, a civilian who will not even, quote unquote, civilian who will not even be seen by the medical people in white tents, are able to put together this data, and you are personally impacted, as well as children who now have permanent neurological damage and others. And that's just the physical. It's not even accounting for the mental impact, that the mental health impact to you and to others who have felt this, who've experiencing the betrayal, plus the betrayal of the system and also the betrayal of their bodies, where they can no longer do the things that they were able to do before.
Yep.
So On behalf of our organization, our foundation, Ryan, myself, I mean, my gosh, thank you so much for your courage to come forward, not just to speak about
Amen.
this,
Yeah.
but to also just sit there and do this work. I mean, my God.
Mm-hmm. That the IG should have done.
Should have done.
If I could say anything, is prevent the continued suffering of those who lived through November 20th and prevent it from happening to the next group of families that live out a tragedy like that. And that's what real leadership would show.
Couldn't have said it better ourselves. And with that, we'll see you next episode.
Thank you, Kat.
Thank you so much for giving families and giving me the time today to share more about Red Hill.
Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.